Well, hello everyone, it's John Loughlin here. I'm the Director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to say that we're joined this week by our co-host Peter Lavelle, and that we have as our main guest Ewen Stewart. Ewen, you've been on the forum before it was in video format. We're delighted to have you back to talk about the economic collapse of the West. Ewen Stewart is a consultant in the city. He works for Walbrook Economics and he writes for Global Britain. And on globalbritain.co.uk, Ewen, you published a couple of weeks ago a series of articles, mainly about the British economy and how catastrophically it has fallen behind in the world in absolute and in relative terms, and how Britain and indeed the whole of Europe is getting poorer and poorer. Since you wrote your articles, Ewen, a number of events have appeared which have occurred which corroborate your thesis. I'm thinking of the catastrophic figures that have come out of France, where I live, where the debt, the annual deficit is, I believe, even higher than it was when Greece went into emergency mode during the Euro crisis. We've had bond prices in Britain go above the level at which they went when Liz Truss allegedly crashed the economy. We've seen incredible announcements out of Germany, with Volkswagen closing down its factories all over the place. Volkswagen is far from the only example. It's just the most recent one. Siemens, BASF, all these other giants are doing the same thing. And perhaps most significantly, but on the other side, we've seen the successful BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia. Can you summarize, Ewen, for our viewers, the basic argument that you make in your 4 papers? And I hope that we can, of course, I know you concentrate mainly on Britain, but if you can enlarge the discussion to include the rest of Europe and who knows, maybe the whole of the West, that would be very interesting. Go ahead, Ewen.
John, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be back on your show again. I wrote quite a major piece, and as you say, it's about Britain, but actually what's for Britain is for the West generally, or particularly Europe, but I would say the West generally. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is as relevant in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, wherever that might be. And the paper was written, the UK had its budget today, and I won't concentrate on the detail of that, safe to say it was awful. The government have put taxes up by £40 billion today, and that money is being recycled into inefficient public spending, which will further undermine the British edifice. But we can talk about that if you want later, but that's probably not the meat. But the context was today's budget, and I thought it was worth just looking where the British economy was. And there's a lot of charts in my paper, and you're welcome to download it if you like, looking at Europe as well. So where are we relative and absolutely to other parts of the world? We then asked the question, why did the decline happen? And I'll concentrate on that a little bit. There are a number of theories, some I think accurate, and some, like the concept that there's been austerity, is just frankly laughable. And in the UK context, Brexit has been blamed for the UK's poor performance. But I think I show in the paper that while Brexit has not been a great triumph, it certainly hasn't been a failure either. I think it's been pretty neutral, and that's a convenient excuse. But to understand why we're underperforming in Europe, we've got to understand that underperformance. The rest of the paper looked at the UK's particular problem, which is a productivity problem in the public sector. Talk about that a little bit, but it's probably fairly UK-centric, and the fact that the government has singularly failed to address that. And I came up with some suggestions as to how a good government might try and save this dire situation, because be under no illusions, in the West, we've had a very privileged existence for centuries. We have written the world's rules, but we will be the last generation to do that unless we get our act together. And that sounds polemic, but I don't think it is polemic, because the decline we are facing is very real and very significant. Many people don't necessarily notice it because of technological advance. Generally, people might feel they're a little bit better off, but relative to other parts in the world, Europe's decline is palpable, and it's also built on a mountain of debt. And that contrasts with the East and the BRICS generally, not exclusively, but generally, which aren't built on debt. So our monetary systems, and I'm not polemic about this because I do think central banks can keep the show on the road for a long period of time, but the monetary system is fragile and is being made more fragile by short-term politics. So if we just look at the decline, I think you can possibly show some of the charts, but it's not an exaggeration to say that over the last 5 years, that first chart there looks at GDP per head. And per head or per capita is what's critical, because anyone can grow GDP quite rapidly if you take on a lot of government debt, and anyone can grow GDP if you increase the population. What really matters is the GDP per head. And the UK has imported a vast number of people, and even then it's hardly managed to grow. But on a per capita basis, over the last 10 years, that blue line, as you can see, has barely improved.
It
now,
seems to start in
at
2006. The blue line seems to leave the yellow line in 2006. Is that right?
That is right. And that's about 2 years before the global financial crisis, which I think was the first major shock. But the trend, and this would apply to France, Germany, many European countries, and America. Since the Industrial Revolution, countries have grown at 2.5% regularly. So actually, the performance of Britain and the European Union in the last 15 years, relative to trend, has been, or most European countries, not all, has been worse than at any other point in the last 200 years, with the exception of wars. So in peacetime, this is the worst performance. And that needs quite a lot of explaining. We then look at figure 2, which I don't think I've given you, but it's in the book. And in the British context, we look at Switzerland, America, Australia, the G7, Canada, Germany, UK, France, and the Euro area. We look at it growth by decade or per capita wealth by decade. And basically, in 2000, Switzerland and the United States were richer than Britain. Australia was about 15% poorer. Today, Australia is 32% richer. Canada is substantially richer. And the underperformance, the point I try to make is it's not just a question that advanced countries per se are underperforming. It's advanced countries in one part of the world. That part of the world is our part of the world. Canada has performed much better. Australia has performed much better. United States has performed better. It is a UK and European problem. And I then go on to highlight that 20 years ago, the average American was 16% richer than the average Briton. Today, it's 65%. And only one state, Mississippi, is poorer. So America operates.
The Eurozone is on the level of, I believe, between the 48th and 49th poorest American states by per capita GDP.
That's correct, and even that is misleading, actually, because property prices in America are generally, not everywhere, but in many places, much lower. Energy bills are much lower. Taxes are generally lower. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, but do people in the UK, is the population aware of this? I mean, I know Louisiana, I know Georgia, I know Arkansas. These are not rich places.
The UK is interesting. There are parts of the UK that are quite prosperous.
Sure.
So if you inhabit central London or some of the Hampshire or Surrey or some of or Cambridge or maybe even Edinburgh, there are prosperous boroughs and regions within the UK, but there's an awful lot of the UK has flatlined for years. And I'm not sure the average Briton is aware of it, actually. We've tried to make the case, and certainly this publication's had quite a lot of airplay, actually. But I think the more people understand it, the better. And I hope in the continent of Europe, people begin to understand the measure of failure that our elites have imposed on the population. So if you were to visit, I don't know which part of America you live in, but if you were to visit the Northeast or parts of Yorkshire or Lancashire, there is palpable decline.
I think Ewan, I think surely the trend is what really counts. And we haven't got the graph here, but you've said that the trend dates back to 15 years ago or 20 years ago when, as you said, Australia was poorer and is now richer, and America and so on. But to what extent is GDP in the United States, both in absolute terms and per capita, to what extent is it just a lot of overpaid lawyers, and not as Emmanuel Todd says, and not actual production, and still less, of course, high level production?
Well, and also just the tail end of that, does GDP tell us anything anymore?
Well, actually, you're asking a philosophical point, and I have some sympathy with what you say. It's one measure. And I do think, actually, in the UK case, and I go on later in this presentation to say that a generation ago, the private sector accounted for 2/3 of British GDP. Today, it accounts for just over half. And it's worse than that because in the private sector, large sectors are dominated by government. The energy sector, for example, with the dash to net zero, the banking sector, which is regulated with an inch of its life, employment law, etc. So we are living in a highly financialized, highly indebted, highly socialized society where I do agree with your point. I can't speak for America. I don't live there. I obviously know a fair bit about the data and have visited it several times, but I'm well aware that there's a huge wealth disparity between the top 5 or 10% of the population, Wall Street and Main Street, if you want to put it that way. There's an element of that in the UK, but where I think the UK is in a lot of trouble is that its private sector has been under the cosh. And I think I do agree with your philosophical point. How do you measure prosperity? And GDP is part of the jigsaw. But it's not the entire jigsaw. You can look at life expectancy. You can, you can look at population densities. There's all sorts of ways you can, happiness surveys if you're into that sort of thing. But what I think we can say, and I think you've got figure 4, which is a chart worth looking at. It's the one after that, I think. That's the one. Now, what this looks at is, again, it's a GDP measure. It looks at purchasing power parity expressed as the percentage of global GDP. So this is if you like, the weights. So the raw power of a country. So in 1990, the OECD, of which America and Britain and Europe is part of, was the only show in town. It was 62% of the global economy. Today, it's the biggest show in town at 44%, but it's lost a third of its power. East Asia has doubled its weight from 17% to 32%. And China's gone from nowhere to be the world's largest economy on a purchasing power parity basis. The main losers have been the European Union, Germany, Japan, France, and the UK. So the general point is this: not that I think America will be displaced, and we can talk about the US election, which I think is very important, if you like. But what we are finding is that the West's lead is increasingly being challenged. And what I think is also quite interesting is that and it's beyond the scope of this paper, but I think it's an important point. The West has soft power advantages and a highly financialized system, but it has largely lost its manufacturing base. The Chinese manufacturing base is twice that of America's. And frankly, the manufacturing base in Britain and France and various other countries is tiny now. Germany, not so much so, but is in desperate structural difficulty, as I'm sure our listeners are aware.
But is that the key then, Ewen? Is that the key? Shrinking, is disindustrialization the key?
Well, I think there's two elements. America is energy self-sufficient. Europe is not. Britain has chosen not to be. But the BRICS generally are commodity and energy self-sufficient and net exporters, and they're increasingly manufacturing net exporters as well. These are glacial changes. They don't happen overnight, but we are reaching a tipping point where the West is increasingly finding it difficult to dominate on the world stage. And frankly, if we don't get our act together, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. And I think we're adopting policies which are exceptionally redistributionary. There is population change, which is breaking demos down. And there's a distinct loss of economic and cultural confidence, which ultimately will undermine our children and grandchildren's future.
But Ewen, is it possible to get our act together, or have we past the point of no return? If I understand correctly, the United States debt has increased by 43 billion in the last couple of months. The debt, I mentioned it in my introduction, the debt situation in France is absolutely catastrophic. And yet the best that Mario Draghi can come up with is a proposal for even more debt. Have we passed the point of no return? I mean, how do you reindustrialize? How do you get out of the debt trap?
And I think it's every 3 months the U.S. adds $1 trillion to its debt. I mean, it's accelerating. To kind of ask John's question in a different way, in a much shorter way, but what the West has been doing for the last 20 years, this is a choice. They've chosen to do this. I mean, I'm sure you are an esteemed economist. That's why you're here. But you're not the only person with access to this data. I mean, the decline is palpable, but it seems like the elites have made a choice. And is it a choice for them? Is it an ideological choice? Is it inertia? Or is it the lack of an alternative? I mean, this is something I've known John for many years. We've talked about this issue over and over and over again. These are choices.
I agree with you. They are choices, and you're right. All the data in my paper comes from 3 or 4 main sources. It comes from the IMF, it comes from the British OBR or ONS and Eurostat. These are official data points. Anyone can look at them. I think where my analysis is slightly different is it's quite long term. Generally, the political cycle is extremely short term, and I think there's a lack of awareness of this data. But it's not secret. It's not a magic potion. And I think you're right. I think the West has made a number of choices, and those choices have been to socialize and mollycoddle a population, shower them with welfare. They have been to try and break down, I think, traditional value sets, which has been done through unprecedented migration flows, and also breakdown of the family as a concept, which I think in my economic presentations, we never talked about the family because it was taken as a given, but actually, and most economists don't talk about it, but I think it is extremely important. In the UK, the formal unemployment number is, I can't remember what the number is, but it's about 3% of the population. That's bollocks. There's 9.5 million people by the government's own data not working. They're not classified as unemployed. They might be long-term sick, or they might have mental health issues, or whatever it might be. But the number of people who are out with economic activity has increased markedly. and that has been replaced by a migration of about 1 million a year. When you consider the UK's population is 60 odd million, and America's, is it 350? It's a big number on an annual basis. So these are choices. We could debate why they've made these choices all day, and I do agree with John's general point. It'd be very difficult to unravel it, but I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. And ultimately, if we think it's too late, you should get out of here. Because the future won't look pretty. I don't take that view. I take the view that we've got to try and point out the failings and come up with a better way. And to my mind, that is rebuilding family. It is rebuilding community. It is having a sensibly sized government, which isn't socializing every single risk, and getting back to sound money, i.e., controlling the deficits and starting to unwind that over time. I mean, we've seen today that the Labour government in Britain's done the opposite of what I've suggested. Yeah. So I'm not so naive to believe that suddenly there's going to be a road to Damascus conversion. The trends in this country are going the other way. But I tell you, there's an interesting thing, and I'll be very interested in your view on this, because although we haven't met before, I guess you're based in the States.
I'm actually based in Moscow.
Are you? Okay, that's interesting. I'd like to have a chat with you about that another time, actually.
Sure. I'm sorry, you're talking about the focus on the family, on social values, traditional. Yeah, that's why I live here. Keep going.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know who's going to win the election in America. The betting odds say Trump will win. It's about 60-40. I'll believe it when I see it, okay? Will it make a difference? I don't know. But what I do know is if the Democrats win, the limited free speech that there currently is, will be closed down yet further.
Yep.
And the reason I think it's very important that the Republicans and Donald Trump win is that in the UK, the loss of free speech has been so extreme, I wouldn't have thought it possible.
Me too.
I mean, I've always believed that this country was a free, liberal, and tolerant country. And I've been absolutely shocked and appalled, as many people have been, most people I know actually, by the mainstream media's extraordinary spin, which doesn't seem to be based on reality on almost anything. I don't want to go into specifics.
Yeah, well, but your point is well taken. I mean, if you have control of the public sphere as far as people interacting with one another, if that is suppressed, then our conversation about what are the options for the future, well, that's irrelevant because you can't talk about them. Right before you interjected that, I wanted to say to you, you sound like a revolutionary to me because you really challenge all of the pieties. And that's what we have to do. That, for me, is the only way out. Will it succeed? I don't know. But if we can't talk about it, then there's no option. And then, and then that's what the powers that be will say, there's only plan A.
Yeah. That's exactly correct. And without getting into the rights and wrongs of Donald Trump, one of his chief advisors is Elon Musk, and both the European Union and the British Labour Party have been quite clear that they view X as a purveyor of false news. Now, you know as well as I do that one person's false news is someone else's truth. And we get to the truth by debating and coming and convincing people of what is right. You start to close down news avenues and you start to censor, in the British case through Ofcom or whatever it is, and you then get only an official narrative, and that is Pravda. You know,
well, I can tell you there were 6 cases against me by Ofcom. Okay,
yeah,
and the backstory is that the 6 different cases, it was the same single individual that brought the case. Only one complaint made in the UK.
Yeah.
One person made 6 complaints. Okay, and the amount of legal work we had to do, and they wouldn't even tell me the person. Okay.
Yeah. No, there's a terrible. We've discussed this on the forum and on Peter's own show many times. Perhaps we could concentrate on the economics, though. I'm sure the 3 of us are in full agreement about the free speech issue. You started to mention the United States, Ewan, and we've seen that that Europe is doing even worse than the United States. But I'm sure you'll agree that the United States has many of the same problems, particularly, obviously, disindustrialization and indebtedness. I believe it also has the same problem of a burgeoning public sector. I have a colleague and acquaintance called Stephen Baskerville, who's recently produced a book called something like Who Lost America, or How Did We Lose America? He is himself both American and British, and his argument is very simple. It's that he starts off the book, he says, the iron law of Washington is that if you pay somebody, a public official, to solve a problem, their incentive will be for that problem to remain, not for that problem to be solved, because that's what their job is. And he describes the managerial doom loop by which more bureaucrats generate more bureaucrats. The French member of the European Parliament, Sarah Knafo, was on television the other day saying that in 1980 there were 1.4 million farmers in France, and I think what was the figure? I don't know. Let's say I've forgotten what the figure was. Let's say 50,000 employees at the Ministry of Agriculture. Now there are 400,000 farmers. In other words, from 1.4 million to 400,000. But the number of bureaucrats in the Ministry of Agriculture has doubled. And this isn't just funny. This is, in fact, the doom loop, because the more bureaucrats you have, the more regulations there are, because that's what bureaucrats do. They regulate.
So it's by design.
And the more they regulate, obviously, as you said a moment ago, Ewan, about the financial sector, the greater the absolute and general costs are on the sector in question. But I mean, we all know, we can all, I'm sure, agree that that's the case for France, and it's clearly the case for Britain as well. But I think it's a problem. It seems to me, if Stephen Baskerville is right, that it's also a problem that the United States faces.
You're of course right.
Okay, we've lost Ewan there. Let's see if he can come back.
It's a cost of doing business, folks. It's called technology. Okay.
Yeah.
While we're waiting for our guest to come back, it was interesting that Elon Musk was mentioned, and I think it's very problematic because Elon Musk wants to get rid of workers. Okay, I mean,
yes,
that's something, you know. It's a double-edged sword when you come. You know, he went to Twitter, he cleaned it out, all of the superfluous employees. Good for him. It's his company. But you know, if you do that on scale, John, I mean, I'm sure that you do know what the most common profession is for middle-aged men in America. It's called transportation, drivers. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. You institute self-driving trucks and cars. You're going to put a lot of people out of work. Okay.
Yes.
And of course, as it's the social instability that would create would be enormous. There we go. We're back.
I don't know what happened there. Someone tried to call me and it ruined the connection. Anyway, I'm back.
So go ahead, Ewan. Go ahead.
Yeah,
the American, the managerial doom loop.
Yeah, there's a chart in my pack. If I can find the number, you can. It's figure 8. If you can put that chart up, it looks at it's one measure of the exponential increase in regulation, which is not that one. It's probably that's it there. That is the global ESG policy interventions. And that's one measure of this managerial doom loop we're talking about.
ESG is the, just for those who may not know the acronym, it's the environmental, sustainable and governance criteria that I believe the World Economic Forum is at the origin of.
It is indeed, and whether we like it or not, they've been somewhat successful in prosecuting their agenda. And
they are, of course, the WEF obviously is the absolute embodiment, the epitome of the managerial doom loop, because the origins of Davos lie in management. The Klaus Schwab is a professor of management, and his original forum back in the 70s was called the European Management Forum. So he is the embodiment, and of course the whole cross-fertilization that Davos promotes between companies and governments is part of that managerial ethic. And I think that many of the problems that we are diagnosing here in your talk, Ewen, are connected with this dominance of the managerial class. You mentioned Britain being a liberal, freedom-loving society, but as you know very well, or at least I assume you agree with me, that Britain has for decades now drifted into a managerial direction. The whole health and safety, the whole culture of health and safety, the whole culture of regulation has long been embedded in British public life, and the current government, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, are very much an embodiment of that themselves.
Undoubtedly. I mean, I would say that Britain is at the avant-garde on a global basis of this revolution. It's probably more advanced in Britain than it even is in the EU. You look at their buying on the altar of net zero, for example. The UK is taking that to an extreme that even the European Union is not doing. Just one word in America. The trend is across the West. I completely agree. But I make just one slight distinction. I think in America, because of the federal system of government, there's a big difference between California or Washington or some of these states and Texas or Florida. So there is quite a lot of individual state power. The scale of government is lower in the States than it is in Europe. Generally, it's about 10 basis points lower. And the US spends more on defense than European countries do. So the welfare element is definitely lower in the States. So the trends, and I also think that there's a debate in America whether Trump's administration, if he wins, can sort it out. We can debate all day, but and I wouldn't be that optimistic, but there is at least a debate with some quite serious business people and individuals still holding to the concept of freedom and liberty and actually understanding, I think, what is going on. So there's a challenge to the WEF agenda, if you like. That challenge is very weak in the UK. There are, of course, many people like myself who are very concerned by what's going on, but we're not in the mainstream. And I can't comment to the same extent on European countries, but I get it's the same. I get the same impact, of course. In France, there are many people fighting against it, as there are in other European countries as well. But it's much more advanced. I think there's a chance of turning it around in America. Wouldn't be optimistic, but I think there's a chance of turning it around. But we're all moving in the same direction, and ultimately, it spells disaster, in my judgment, for the West, certainly in terms of liberal government.
Yeah, but the professional managerial class, I mean, and it is a class, okay? And as far as I'm concerned, it's devoid of the values of the vast majority of the people that they govern over. But isn't the very nature, maybe even by design, the professional managerial class, their very existence and the extension of their power negates the necessity of politics. They don't really like politics, okay? They want managerial control because that is the radiant future, okay? And particularly again, if we use the example of the United States, the Democrats. I mean, this is the altar in which they worship, is managerial processes. Okay, and we can do the culture wars and abortion, the Second Amendment. That's always the trimmings, but what they're focused on is managerial control of the economy, and then the rest of it is just window dressing.
Well, if they're focused on the managerial control of the economy, they're not very good at it.
Well, I mean, that we're talking, we're talking about maybe individuals in office, high office, but part of the professional managerial class, maybe even its core, is lobbying for certain interests. I mean, they have mutual interests. They recognize each other. They go to the same schools. They speak the same idiom when it comes to. I mean, I think that doing a very good job of it. I get your point in comparison to maybe the UK, but I think the overall goal is the same. And I'm pessimistic that it's almost irreversible, unfortunately.
I agree with what you're saying. I don't think they've got a lot of popular support.
But that doesn't matter because they don't care about politics.
Yeah, you're right. But we are living in a. Well, theoretically, the elected politicians do have the levers, theoretically, to make changes. But in reality, it's become increasingly difficult because the mainstream media, you've got a permanent bureaucracy. I think there's been a cultural revolution in many of the institutions which have become extremely woke. There's legal fare. There are international treaties and agreements, often UN level, and and equality legislation, which would have to be repealed if you wanted to change government substantially, and that'd be incredibly difficult to do. So I think you're right. I think the political debate in the UK has tended to narrow between Conservative and Labour. Yes, there's an angry debate, but it's at the margin. On the substance, very little difference. So, and a lot of people are spotting this, that they are beginning to question how much of a democracy this really is, because whoever wins, the same tide continues. And I think there are theoretically the levers that could be pulled, but in practice, it would take a very, very determined government. This was the tragedy of Boris Johnson. He won with a big majority, and theoretically, he could have actually changed the UK. He was elected on an anti-woke, pro-Brexit, small state ticket. And what did he do? Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. And that's disillusioned an awful lot of people in the political process. I think the UK is facing a potential crisis, though, because while I'm not polemic, and I've generally argued that central banks have a lot of power and you shouldn't expect things just to collapse, the UK is pushing the envelope very far, and there's a high degree of discontent. So I think what you can say is that this government's about to become exceptionally unpopular for a variety of reasons, and the population is upset, confused, angry. Many of them come up with different solutions to the problem, but very few people think this is a well-run place. And I get that impression about what people think about Germany increasingly, about France. And Germany and France really matter because they're the linchpin of the European Union. So I think we're in a really quite a difficult square here. But I think, let's be optimistic. A good proportion of the population are beginning to smell the coffee. They are beginning to realize that actually things are getting worse. The opportunity for their children is not as good as it was for them. They're seeing cultural change that they don't like.
Well, can you address John's question? I think it's very germane here. I think one predicate for turning this situation around is a new industrialization, where you have a more vibrant, powerful middle class based on wealth and wealth that they can transfer, which we've seen over a half century of decline. I mean, politics is such a elastic thing. Politics, it's like woke politics, like I said, the abortion issue. I'm not really interested in really any of those things. I'm interested in the well-being of individuals and families, because historically that works. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
kind of going back to John's question, how do you we've never seen a reindustrialization. Okay. I don't think there is historical record for it. And considering how financialized the financial system is that even possible? Because the more a country is financialized, they have this privilege of choosing winners, and those winners may not necessarily do what you can throw a lot of money at something, but is it going to reindustrialize? That's kind of a long, convoluted question. Sorry.
Yeah. For me, and I think we're probably on the same page, the basis of a good society is a society where families and communities are strong. And those families and communities are strong where there are lots of private independent companies. They don't all have to be industrial. I think some of them do need to be industrial, but they can be all sorts of services as well. What we have unfortunately seen is the small petty bourgeois class, if you like, being squeezed. So you've got a number of mega institutions. If you look at the UK high street, it's dominated by chains, for example. It's not to say there aren't independents, of course there are. But you are seeing a concentration of capital, and everything government does undermines the family. It's at best neutral in the family. I would say it's hostile to it. And not only that, its regulation makes it harder and harder for small companies to succeed. So what you're seeing is a hollowing out of it. I suppose the German term is the Mittelstand, if you like, in the UK, with a huge bias to financial type industries and property type companies over productive companies. And today's budget makes that just that little bit at the margin worse, just that little bit worse. So can it be turned around? Policy, not without a total turning on head of policy. And at the end of my paper, I make some proposals, which are quite small beer, really, to start that process. But if we can't actually take the power off government and back to people and communities, we will eventually become brides and grooms of the state, and we will basically become servants of that state. And we've moved already in a way that I wouldn't have thought possible. And the speed of that change is picking up, not slowing down. And that is agitating people, though. On the positive side, a lot of people can see it's wrong. They don't like it. And what we're trying to do with papers like this is to just open the debate into areas that people perhaps instinctively know about, but don't have the numbers at their fingertips. And the more people who begin to see what's going on, the more people begin to wake up. Can we achieve our aims before it's too late? I don't know. I've got to believe we can, and we've got to try.
Ewan, you mentioned a moment ago central banks and their power. And a day or two ago, Janet Yellen, the chairman of the Fed, was asked about the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And as she was answering, the seal that was attached to her lectern, which I assume is the seal of the president of the Fed, fell off. a bit like the letters falling off behind Theresa May during her catastrophic party conference speech in 2019, if I remember, 2017. I've asked you this on the last time you came on the forum, but when we were still an X space. The BRICS have introduced, as I understand, some kind of payment system. And a lot of people have got very excited about this, saying that it's de-dollarization. I think you're skeptical about de-dollarization in the sense that you think there is enough inertia in the system for it not to have much effect in the short or perhaps even medium term. But surely, if, as Peter said a few moments ago, debt goes up by $1 trillion, whatever it is, every year.
No, every few
and
months. Every
what?
few months.
Every few months.
Yeah.
And if in the Eurozone we've shot ourselves, and I'm in France, so I can say we've shot ourselves in the foot by, as of course Britain has too, by impounding the sovereign assets of other countries. Is the toolbox basically running out of tools?
Imperial Rome, at the start of the empire, their coins, the denarii, was almost entirely silver. Was it 456 they collapsed in the Western Empire around about then? It was a 0.002% silver at the end. But that process took 400 or 500 years. We in the West undoubtedly are undermining our huge privilege of financial seniority. I could show you a chart that if we'd been born in 1300 and we'd ordered a flagon of ale and we'd come back in the Victorian period 500 years later, the flagon of ale would have cost about 3 times as much, but we'd have thought it was a bit pricey, but we would have probably coughed up and had our ale. That flagon of ale now, in the last 100 years, has gone up about 200 times. Yeah. So I can't tell you with the Roman analogy whether we're in 380 or 440, but we are drinking out of the last chance saloon. The problem with the BRICS, and this is my personal opinion, and there's no doubt the world is shifting. I'm not going to dispute that for a second. And I think I started this talk by basically saying that in Europe, this is the last generation we will have a seat at the top table if we're not careful. Okay, so that's my starting point. I think America's in a stronger position than we are, but there are major cracks there as well. The problem that the BRICS face is a cultural one. The West historically was unified by Christendom, Beethoven, Descartes. We can name the greats, and of course it tacked. But Russia's a Christian country and quite a conservative country, but it is different to Modi's India. It is different to China and Brazil and various other places. So I'm not convinced that the BRICS are unified other than a dislike of the West. And I think if they can convince me otherwise, the days of the West would be in real jeopardy. The BRICS are certainly, if the West is highly indebted and has soft power assets, is highly financialized, the BRICS are generally, but not always, the opposite of that. They're quite lowly indebted, they have manufacturing, and they have commodities. That's a very great simplification. But and there's no doubt that we are moving from an overwhelmingly dominant US and European satellite position to a world where power is increasingly shared, albeit I think the US will remain the paramount nation for quite a while. But I can also see that the sanctioning of Russia, and I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of that debate, but just talk about it factually, has sent a message to China and Brazil and Argentina that you hold dollars and you could be sanctioned if they don't like you.
Well, see, that's the whole thing. I mean, there is an obvious trend of de-dollarization. It's not accelerating as so many people are saying. It's there, okay?
Yeah.
Exchanging in local currencies, it's there and it's growing. But you said the dislike of the West. I think we need to abbreviate that to the fear of the West, because that's what it is. Again, these central banks, Brazilian banks and Indian banks, have already done it to Russia. as much as they would like to deal with local currencies, they fear sanctions and secondary sanctions. And there's another problem. Talking, de-dollarization is a very popular talking point, but basically it's like, but you do it first and I'll follow. Okay. So we have this kind of critical, I think the medium term is pretty clear. The long term is obviously clear, but it's this time ahead of us, how they manage it. Now, the Chinese have their own version of a SWIFT system. It's in its infancy, and they've been working on it. Obviously, Russia is interested in it, and other countries. But I with our guest here, I think I'm much more closer to you than I think most people would think, because BRICS is a noble idea. I know where it's coming from, and I support it. But getting to the finish line is going to be a lot of work. I mean, BRICS, there's a literature, the world beyond the West. Okay, it's very well studied and all of that. But how do you get around these massive, long-standing financial institutions? It's really, really hard. And to be honest, if you're an entrepreneur in India and you want to get your product, I'll do it in any currency you want. Okay, I just need to, do my bit. I mean, it gets down. I mean, governments can have a goal, a vision, and all that. But I'm for entrepreneurship. I'm for a mixed economy. I mean, you can't dictate these things. You're going to screw it all up. So it's a good vision, but it's a lot more work than people think.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, you'll be well aware that the price of gold's at an all-time high or very close to it. And I don't play crypto myself. It's not my thing. I don't really understand it. But crypto has been a phenomenal asset class, albeit a very volatile one. And both of those things are saying we do not trust sovereign governments effectively. I think well aware that Russia and China and India increasingly trade commodities in local currency. I think if the challenge there is de-dollarization, it's slow. It'll be a gradual process, and it's ultimately about trust. Actually, who do you trust? And trust in China is not high. I would suggest for some valid reasons. The European Union had an opportunity not to become the major currency, but I think there's no prospect of that now, or very limited prospect, no prospect, I would say. And it's in America's hand. If they continue debating themselves with the trillion you mention on a monthly basis, which is broadly correct, in my Roman analogy holds, it's sooner or later.
Thinking differently, instead of just a currency. I mean, and this is I think Vladimir Putin showed a facsimile of what a BRICS currency would, a BRICS dollar or whatever it would be called. But there's a lot of very serious thinking. I've talked to some of the people behind it of creating a currency based on commodities, on real things, on energy, on wheat, precious metals, and things like these are all things that the world wants. The dollar is supposed to mean trust, but that trust has been grossly abused. John has already mentioned it. I mean, Venezuelan gold, Russian assets being frozen, effectively stolen. But the people I've been talking to, and I'm not an economist, but if we focus ourselves on a commodity or a basket of commodities, that has a chance of taking off, because these are all things that people will always want for all time. Even water is a commodity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the reasons I was skeptical of the euro, and this applies to the BRICS, by the way, as well, is Germany had a strong economy, Greece did not, and melding it together at one level causes problems. If you created a BRICS currency between Russia, China, maybe Saudi, I mean, the Middle East is really interesting in this, actually, and the Middle East is playing a very interesting game, but it seems to be moving more away from America. That seems to be the trend. But I don't think having a single BRICS currency is
No,
credible.
but hang on, wait a minute, Ewan. They're not talking about having a single currency in the same way as the euro is a single currency. They're talking about that thing that you remember Keynes drew it up at the beginning of the at Bretton Woods. What are they called? Special SDRs, special drawing rights. They're supposed to be a payment system, not a single.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a payment system is a good starting point. To create a single currency would be mad, in my view. To create a currency based, or to create a commodity based currency around a basket, I think it's got a lot of merit, so long as it's properly policed and the real underlying assets are there. But I think there would be interest in that actually in the West as well, actually, because an awful lot of people I know, professional investors, are well aware of the degree of debasement, and it changes their investment philosophy as well, because if you think you're always going to be bailed out by the central bank, you'll swing the bat, so it actually changes people's behavior, and isn't not necessarily in a productive way, by the way. So, I think people can see, and it's one of the reasons gold has done so well, apart from the fact there's been sovereign buying of it as people have de-dollarized, sold sovereign assets. That certainly is an interesting project, no question about it.
Well, Ewan, it's been absolutely fascinating as ever listening to you. I encourage our viewers to read your 4 papers on globalbritain.co.uk. That's where your paper is published, as I understand.
I'll send you a link later, and feel free to send it to your contacts if you wish.
And thank you so much indeed for giving us your time. It's been an absolute pleasure as ever talking to you, and I'm sure our viewers will have enjoyed it as well.
Well, John, a delight as always, and Peter, delightful to chat with you. I enjoyed our conversation a lot.
Very good. Thanks, everyone. All the best. See you next week.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.